Wednesday afternoon, 1:30 p.m. The courtroom doors opened, and a 17-year-old boy walked in like he was stepping onto a battlefield. Blake Ashford didn't look scared. He didn't look nervous. He looked angry, furious, in the way only someone who had never been told no can be. His designer clothes were wrinkled, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with the certainty that this entire room existed to inconvenience him. Across the courtroom, seated quietly in the front row, was his mother. Victoria Ashford sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers trembling just enough to give away the fear she was trying to hide. She watched her son pace back and forth like a caged animal, knowing that whatever happened next might change him forever. This wasn't Blake's first time standing before Judge Frank Caprio. It wasn't even his second. It was his third court appearance in just 6 months. But something about today felt different. Not because of the charges, not because of the judge, but because of what had happened just 10 minutes earlier in the parking lot when a mother tried one last time to convince her son to take responsibility and failed. As the bailiff called the case, the air in the courtroom grew heavy. Reckless endangerment, assault on a public servant, destruction of property, violation of probation. Serious charges for a 17-year-old who still believed his family name could erase consequences. Judge Caprio looked up from the file and immediately sensed it. The anger, the entitlement, the complete absence of remorse. What happens when a child believes a parent's love is a license to disrespect them? What happens when money replaces accountability? And what happens when a mother who has spent years protecting her son finally runs out of ways to save him from himself? Before we go any further, if you believe that real justice is about accountability, not excuses, take a moment to support this channel. These are stories that remind us why respect, responsibility, and consequences still matter. Because what happened next wasn't just a court ruling. It was a lesson about love failure and the price of entitlement. Before Blake Ashford ever raised his voice in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, before the shouting, the threats, and the humiliation, there was a pattern. Blake was 17 years old, but he had been living like consequences were optional for most of his life. He grew up surrounded by comfort, money, and protection. When mistakes happened, and there were many, they were handled quietly. Doors closed. Phone calls were made. Problems disappeared before they had time to teach a lesson. And at the center of that system was his mother. Victoria Ashford had spent years trying to keep her son safe from the hard edges of the world. When Blake got into trouble at school, she smoothed things over. When his temper crossed lines, she blamed stress. When his behavior escalated, she convinced herself it was just a phase. Each time she told herself she was helping him. What she didn't realize was that every rescue taught Blake the same message: someone else would always clean up his mess. By the time Blake turned 17, the warnings were louder. Police reports replaced school meetings. Probation replaced parental discipline. And yet even then, Blake believed the system existed for other people, not for him. This hearing marked his third appearance in Judge Caprio's courtroom in just 6 months. That fact alone spoke volumes. The charges were no longer minor. Reckless endangerment, assault on a public servant, destruction of property, violation of probation. These weren't misunderstandings or youthful mistakes. These were signs of a young man who had never learned where the line was or what happened when you crossed it. And still, Blake walked into court that afternoon convinced this would end the same way as before. His father wasn't there. He was traveling in Europe on business. But Blake didn't see that as a problem. To him, it was an excuse. He believed his mother had promised to handle it, that she would call the right people, that the family's name, their money, their connections would once again make everything go away. 10 minutes before the hearing in the courthouse parking lot, Victoria tried to say something different. She tried to tell him this time was serious. She tried to tell him he needed to accept responsibility. She tried to tell him she couldn't fix this for him anymore. Blake didn't hear concern. He heard betrayal. By the time he entered the courtroom, his anger had already been ignited. Not at the charges, not at the law, but at the woman who was no longer willing to shield him from the consequences he had earned. Judge Caprio sensed it immediately. He had seen thousands of defendants over decades on the bench. He had seen fear, regret, arrogance, and denial. But there was something different about Blake Ashford. This wasn't just defiance of the law. It was a deep belief that accountability was optional and that authority existed only to be challenged. As Blake paced the courtroom floor, his mother sat silently in the front row, already carrying the weight of blame he was preparing to unload. She wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to stand by her son. What neither of them fully understood yet was that this case wasn't just about criminal charges. It was about a moment every parent fears and every child eventually faces. The moment when protection ends and responsibility begins. The moment Judge Frank Caprio asked Blake Ashford to step forward and state his name, the tension in the courtroom tightened like a drawn wire. Blake stopped pacing. He didn't straighten his posture. He didn't show respect. Instead, he turned his head and shot a glare toward his mother as if she were the real defendant standing trial. "Blake Ashford," he said flatly. Then, without hesitation, without shame, he added words that froze the room. "And before we start this whole circus, I want everyone to know I'm only here because my incompetent mother couldn't handle this like she promised." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge Caprio slowly removed his reading glasses, a small movement that carried enormous weight. In that moment, it was clear this case had crossed into unfamiliar territory. "Mr. Ashford," the judge said calmly, "did you just blame your mother for your legal troubles?" Blake didn't hesitate. He turned fully toward her now, pointing, his voice rising. "Yes, I did. You said you'd take care of this. You said Dad's connections would make it disappear. Instead, I'm standing here looking like an idiot." Victoria Ashford's face flushed with embarrassment. Her hands trembled as she tried to calm him. "Blake, please," she said softly. "Lower your voice. We're in a courtroom." That only made it worse. "Don't tell me to lower my voice," Blake snapped. "You've screwed this up completely. First, you let Dad leave for Europe, then you hire some bargain lawyer instead of our family attorney." Judge Caprio stood up. The movement was deliberate, commanding, unavoidable. "Mr. Ashford," he said firmly, "you will not raise your voice to your mother in my courtroom." Blake spun around, redirecting his rage toward the bench. "I'll raise my voice to whoever I want," he shouted. "This is her fault. She was supposed to fix this, and instead she's sitting there like a scared little mouse." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Victoria tried to speak, desperation breaking through her restraint. "Your Honor, Blake is under tremendous stress." "Shut up, Mom," Blake screamed. The words landed like a slap. Everything stopped. Judge Caprio had presided over thousands of cases, but this was different. This wasn't defiance. This wasn't immaturity. This was open public verbal abuse directed at the very person trying to help him. "Mr. Ashford," the judge ordered, "sit down immediately." Blake ignored him. "You know what your problem is?" Blake continued pacing again. "You're weak. Dad left you to handle this because he knew you'd cave under pressure. You always cave." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Blake, please stop. You're making this worse." "I'm making it worse," he yelled. "You had one job, keep me out of court, and you couldn't even do that." Judge Caprio's voice cut through the chaos. "Bailiff Martinez." "Yes, Your Honor." "Restrain Mr. Ashford immediately. He is in contempt of court for disruptive behavior and verbal abuse." Only then did reality finally break through Blake's rage. "Wait," what he said. "You can't arrest me for talking to my own mother." Judge Caprio looked directly at him. "You are not being restrained for talking," the judge said. "You are being restrained for abusing your mother, disrupting this courtroom, and demonstrating complete contempt for authority." Victoria stood up, tears streaming. "Your Honor, please. This isn't who he really is." Blake turned on her again, venom sharper than before. "Don't defend me. I don't need you. Everything you touch turns to garbage." Victoria recoiled as if struck. Her strength collapsed in real time right there in front of everyone. And in that moment, it became clear. This case was no longer about the law alone. It was about character. And Blake Ashford was revealing his one cruel word at a time. Blake Ashford had already crossed every line that afternoon. He had humiliated his mother. He had ignored the judge. He had turned a courtroom into a stage for rage. But what happened next was the moment everything shifted. As the bailiff stood close by, ready to restrain him, Blake straightened his shoulders. For the first time since entering the courtroom, his voice dropped, not in respect, but in cold confidence. "You know what," he said, turning toward Judge Frank Caprio. "Both of you can go to hell. I don't need either of you. I'll handle this myself." Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't react with anger. He simply asked one question. "How will you handle it yourself, Mr. Ashford?" Blake smirked. "I'll call my grandfather," he said. "He owns half the judges in this state. You'll be removed from this case within 24 hours. The room froze. Victoria gasped audibly. "Blake, stop," she pleaded. "You don't know what you're saying." But Blake wasn't finished. "I know exactly what I'm saying," he snapped. "Grandfather always said you were too weak to handle real problems. Maybe it's time I listened to him instead of trusting you." That was the moment Victoria broke. She sank back into her seat, covering her face with her hands as quiet sobs shook her shoulders. The humiliation had turned into something deeper grief, not just for what her son had said, but for who he had become. Judge Caprio stood still, his expression firm, his voice measured, but heavy with consequence. "Mr. Ashford," He said, "You have just threatened a sitting judge while verbally abusing your mother in open court. You have demonstrated contempt for authority, disrespect for family, and a complete disregard for acceptable behavior." Blake crossed his arms, defiant even now. "Do whatever you want," he said. "My family will appeal anything you do." Judge Caprio stepped closer to the edge of the bench. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "your family cannot appeal your character. They cannot overturn your choices, and they cannot protect you from the consequences of who you've chosen to become." The words landed slowly, deliberately, like a verdict before the verdict. Victoria stood again, her voice shaking but determined. "Your Honor," she said, "please don't give up on him. He's angry and confused, but he's still my son." Blake turned on her one final time, his voice sharp and cruel. "Stop begging him," he snapped. "You're embarrassing yourself and me. Just shut up and let me handle this." Judge Caprio exhaled slowly. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "you just told the one person in this room who is advocating for mercy on your behalf to shut up." He paused. "You have shown me exactly who you are." Blake lifted his chin. "Good," he said. "Now you know. I don't need anyone's help, especially not hers." In that moment, the courtroom understood what Judge Caprio had already seen. This wasn't about privilege anymore. It wasn't about money or connections. It was about a young man standing at the edge of adulthood, believing power meant dominance and learning too late that it didn't. The turning point had arrived, and there was no turning back. The courtroom had gone quiet. Not the uneasy silence of confusion, but the heavy silence that comes when everyone knows a line has been crossed and cannot be uncrossed. Judge Frank Caprio looked at Blake Ashford for a long moment. Not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something deeper. Recognition. "Mr. Ashford," Judge Caprio said, his voice steady and unyielding, "in 30 years on this bench, I have never witnessed such open, deliberate disrespect toward a parent who is trying to stand by her child." Blake said nothing. His arms were still crossed, his expression defiant. But the bravado was thinner now, cracking under the weight of what he had unleashed. "You didn't just disrupt this courtroom," the judge continued. "You verbally abused your mother. You threatened a sitting judge. And you demonstrated a complete absence of remorse or self-control." Victoria Ashford stood again, tears streaming down her face. "Your Honor," she pleaded, "I know he looks terrible right now. I know what he said was unforgivable. But he's still my son. 60 days feels so harsh." Blake turned sharply toward her. "Don't beg for me," he snapped. "I don't want your help. I told you to shut up." The words echoed. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. Instead, he delivered the sentence that would change everything. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "you are sentenced to 60 days in juvenile detention for contempt of court, violation of probation, and demonstrated inability to function respectfully in society." Blake's confidence collapsed instantly. 60 days, he shouted. "You can't send me to juvie for talking." Judge Caprio met his eyes. "I am not sending you to juvenile detention for talking," he said calmly. "I am sending you because you abused your mother, threatened this court, and showed me that without intervention, you will continue to hurt the people closest to you." Victoria gasped softly. "Your Honor, please," she said again, her voice breaking. "He doesn't understand what he's doing." Blake lashed out one final time. "Stop begging," he yelled. "You're embarrassing me." Judge Caprio turned toward her. "Mrs. Ashford," he said gently, "your son just explained exactly why 60 days is necessary." He paused. "He needs to learn respect for the people who love him most, because right now he doesn't recognize it." As the bailiff stepped forward, Blake struggled. "This is all your fault," he screamed at his mother. "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed everything." Victoria collapsed back into her seat, sobbing. "I love you, Blake," she said through tears. "I'll be here when you get out." Blake was led away in handcuffs, still shouting that he didn't need anyone. But for the first time in that courtroom, his words sounded hollow. The sentence had been delivered, and the lesson had finally begun. 60 days later, Blake Ashford walked back into the same courtroom. But this time, he didn't storm in. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a plain juvenile facility uniform. The anger that once filled the room ahead of him had faded into something quieter. He stood straighter, spoke softer, and for the first time, he didn't look like someone ready to fight the world. Beside him sat his mother, the same woman he had screamed at, the same woman he had humiliated, the same woman who had never stopped loving him. Judge Frank Caprio studied Blake carefully before speaking. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "have these 60 days taught you anything?" Blake swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. "I learned that my mother wasn't trying to control me. She was trying to protect me from consequences I needed to face, and I treated her terribly for it." Judge Caprio nodded. "What else?" Blake glanced at his mother, then back at the bench. "I learned that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. I spent 60 days with kids who would give anything to have a mother who showed up for them the way mine does. I threw that away because I was angry and selfish. The courtroom was silent. What have you learned about accountability? Judge Caprio asked. Blake didn't hesitate. I learned my mom couldn't fix my problems because I was the problem. Every time she tried to help me, I blamed her for my own choices. Taking responsibility means admitting you're wrong and trying to change. Judge Caprio leaned forward. What would you like to say to your mother? Blake turned to face her fully. His voice cracked. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for screaming at you. I'm sorry for blaming you. I'm sorry for embarrassing you and calling you weak when you were strong enough to keep loving me even when I didn't deserve it. Victoria stood, tears in her eyes, but this time they were different. I forgive you, Blake, she said softly. I never stopped loving you. Judge Caprio delivered his final ruling. Mr. Ashford, you are released today, but your education and respect is not over. You will complete 300 hours of community service working with families affected by domestic violence. Families who lost the mothers who tried to protect them. Blake nodded. Yes, Your Honor. You will also attend weekly counseling focused on anger management and family relationships. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Caprio turned to Victoria. Mrs. Ashford, your son learned what you already knew. Love does not mean enabling destruction. Sometimes love means allowing consequences. As they left the courtroom together, Judge Caprio reflected on a truth many parents struggle to accept. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your child is the freedom to fail, the courage to face consequences, and the chance to become better. Blake Ashford walked into court believing his mother's love entitled him to disrespect her. He walked out understanding that her love made him responsible for honoring it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more courtroom moments that remind us justice and compassion can coexist. Because sometimes the harshest lesson becomes the greatest gift when it teaches us the value of what we almost lost forever.